The night Margaret Holloway found the blood on her kitchen floor, she had already been dead to her children for 6 months. Not literally dead. No, that would have been too convenient for them, too clean. What they wanted was something far worse than her death. They wanted her erasure. They wanted her name off the deed, her fingerprints off the silver, her shadow out of every room that held anything of value. They wanted her to become nothing, a ghost in her own life, a woman who had given everything and deserved, apparently, nothing in return. But on that Tuesday evening in October, when Margaret stepped into her kitchen and saw the dark, rust-colored smear trailing from the back door to the hallway, her first thought was not about her children. It was not about the house. It was not about the war that had been raging since her husband David's funeral. Her first thought was, someone has been inside. And her second thought, the one that made her hands shake and her breath catch like a fist in her throat, was, they're still here. She stood perfectly still. The house was silent, except for the October wind pressing against the windows like something trying to get in or trying to warn her to get out. The kitchen light buzzed overhead, that same fluorescent hum David had promised to fix for 15 years. The blood, if it was blood, had dried at the edges but was still tacky in the center. Fresh enough, recent enough. Margaret was 63 years old. She was 5'4". She weighed 131 pounds. She had arthritis in her left hand and a knee that predicted rain better than any weatherman. She was not the kind of woman who investigated strange noises. She was the kind of woman who called the police, locked the bathroom door, and waited. But something stopped her. Something about the trail. The way it didn't lead toward the living room where the television and electronics were. The way it didn't angle toward the study where David's safe sat behind a painting of the Connecticut coastline. The trail went down the hallway, past the family photographs, past the grandfather clock, past every room that held anything worth stealing. The trail led directly to one place, the locked room. David's room, the one at the very end of the hall, the one he had kept padlocked for the last 3 years of his life, the one he had made Margaret promise, on his deathbed, with his hand trembling in hers and his eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen in 41 years of marriage, never ever to let the children enter. Promise me, Maggie, he had whispered, his voice like paper tearing. No matter what they say, no matter what they offer, no matter what they threaten, that room is yours, only yours, she had promised. Of course she had promised. She would have promised him the moon and the ocean and every star ever named. He was dying. He was her David. He was the only person in this world who had never once made her feel small. But standing there in her kitchen, staring at that dark trail leading to a door she hadn't opened in 7 months, Margaret realized something that sent ice through every vein in her body. She didn't have the key. She had never had the key. David had told her the key was in the inheritance. He had told her she would understand when the time came. She had assumed it was in the safe, or with the lawyer, or tucked inside one of his old books. But after the will was read, after the storm broke, after her children revealed who they truly were, she had been so consumed by survival that she had forgotten about the key entirely. So who had opened that door, and what had they found inside? Margaret reached for the phone on the kitchen wall. Her fingers hovered over the buttons, then she stopped because she heard something. Not from the locked room, not from the hallway, from upstairs. A footstep, just one. Soft, careful, deliberate. Then silence, the kind of silence that listens back. Before you continue, if this story is already pulling you in, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. And if you haven't yet, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Trust me, you're going to want to hear every word of this. To understand the night of the blood, you need to understand the 6 months that came before it. You need to understand the funeral. You need to understand the will. You need to understand the day Margaret Holloway discovered that the 3 children she had raised, loved, sacrificed for, and built her entire identity around were, in the most fundamental sense, strangers. David Holloway died on a Wednesday in April, pancreatic cancer. Fast and merciless, the way that disease always is. 1 month he was planting tomatoes in the backyard, humming Sinatra, wiping dirt on his khakis. The next month he was a skeleton in a hospital bed, his skin the color of old wax, his hands like bird bones wrapped in parchment. Margaret never left his side. Not once. Not for 47 days. She slept in the hospital chair. She ate vending machine sandwiches. She read to him from his favorite novels, Hemingway, Steinbeck, the old ones with short sentences and long truth. She held his hand when the pain came in waves, and she whispered to him in the dark hours when the morphine wasn't enough, and the only medicine left was her voice. Their children visited, of course, but even the word visited is generous. It implies intention, care, presence. What Richard, Catherine, and James did was something more like surveillance. Richard was the eldest, 59, a real estate developer in Hartford with a third wife, 2 mortgages, and a lifestyle built on the assumption that his father's money was already his. He wore suits that cost more than some people's rent. He drove a car that hummed with quiet, expensive menace. He had his father's jawline and his mother's eyes, but he had inherited nothing of either parent's character. Richard did not visit his dying father. Richard audited him. Dad, we need to talk about the house, Richard said one afternoon, standing at the foot of the hospital bed with his arms crossed, as though David were a contractor who had fallen behind schedule. The property taxes alone are— Not now, Richard, Margaret had said quietly. Mother, I'm trying to be practical. Someone has to think about these things. David had opened his eyes then, just barely, just enough, and he looked at his eldest son with an expression Margaret had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but something deeper, something like recognition, as if he were seeing for the first time exactly what his son had become. You'll have your answer soon enough, David whispered. Richard left that day without saying goodbye. Catherine was the middle child, 46. She lived in Boston with a husband named Gerald, who sold insurance in a lifestyle that looked, from the outside, like a catalog for upper middle class contentment. But Catherine was drowning. Credit card debt, a spending habit, and a deep corrosive resentment toward her mother that she had carried since adolescence when she decided, incorrectly but permanently, and David loved Margaret more than he loved his children. Catherine's visits were performances. She would arrive with flowers and leave with questions. Mom, has Dad updated the will? She would ask in the elevator, the flowers still warm in Margaret's hands. I just want to make sure everything is fair. Fair, that word. Margaret would come to despise it. And then there was James, the youngest, 42. The one Margaret secretly, guiltily loved the most. James had been a gentle child, artistic, sensitive, the kind of boy who cried when he found dead birds in the yard and spent hours drawing elaborate maps of imaginary countries. But somewhere between childhood and 42, James had been hollowed out by drugs, by bad choices, by a world that didn't reward gentleness. He had been in and out of rehab 3 times. He owed money to people whose names he was afraid to say out loud, and he had learned over the years that vulnerability could be weaponized. That his mother's love for him was a door that never locked. James was the only one who cried at the hospital, real tears, ugly tears. But even as he wept, even as he held his father's hand and said, I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry, Margaret noticed something she wished she hadn't. James's eyes kept drifting to the safe combination taped inside David's bedside drawer. David died at 3:47 in the morning. Margaret was holding his hand. No one else was there. His last words were not grand or poetic. They were simple, and they were for her. The room, Maggie. Remember the room? Then he was gone, and the world became very quiet and very cold and very large. The funeral was beautiful. Margaret made sure of that. White lilies, David's favorite, a mahogany casket with brass handles. A eulogy delivered by David's oldest friend, a retired professor named Walter Chen, who spoke about David's kindness, his quiet integrity, his belief that a man's worth was measured, not by what he accumulated, but by what he gave away. Margaret sat in the front pew and did not cry. Not because she wasn't shattered. She was so broken that crying seemed insufficient, like trying to empty an ocean with a teaspoon. She didn't cry because she could feel her children behind her watching, waiting, already calculating. The will was read 4 days later in the office of David's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Wynne. Patricia had been David's lawyer for 22 years, and she had a way of looking at people that made them feel transparent. She looked at Richard, Catherine, and James that way now. Margaret sat in a leather chair by the window. Her children sat across from her, arranged like a tribunal. Patricia opened the folder. I'll be direct, she said. David was very specific about his wishes. The will was straightforward. At first, the house in Newbury, valued at approximately $2.3 million, was left entirely to Margaret. The savings account, containing $412,000, was divided equally among the three children. David's investment portfolio, which had been worth roughly $800,000, had been liquidated 6 months before his death. The proceeds had been donated to a list of charities, cancer research, veterans organizations, a children's literacy program in New Haven. The room went very still. "I'm sorry," Richard said, his voice flat and dangerous. "Did you say donated?" "Donated," Patricia confirmed. $800,000. "That's correct." Catherine's face had gone white. "He can't do that. That's our inheritance. It was his money, Mrs. Dalton. He could do whatever he wished with it." "But there's more," Patricia said. She reached into the folder and produced a smaller envelope, cream-colored, sealed with wax. Margaret's name was written on the front in David's careful handwriting. This was left specifically for Margaret. "David instructed me to give it to her privately, but he also wanted me to read a brief statement to the family first." Patricia adjusted her glasses and read aloud. "To my children, I have given you what I believe you have earned. To my wife, I have given you what I know you deserve. The key's in the letter. The truth is in the room. I trust you, Maggie. I have always trusted you." Silence. Then James spoke, his voice small and confused. "What room?" Margaret said nothing. Her heart was hammering. The letter felt alive in her hands, warm, almost pulsing, as if David had sealed a piece of himself inside it. "That's the entirety of the will," Patricia said. "If there are any questions—" "Oh, there are questions," Richard said, standing up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "There are a great many questions, starting with what the hell is in that letter." "That letter is Margaret's private property," Patricia said calmly. "It's not part of the estate. Everything about that man's life is part of this estate. Every secret, every dollar, every room in that house." Richard turned to Margaret, and the look on his face, Margaret would remember it for the rest of her life. It wasn't grief. It wasn't confusion. It was hunger. Pure, undisguised, predatory hunger. "Open it, Mother." "No," Margaret said. The word surprised even her. It came out strong, solid, like a door closing. "Excuse me." "I said no, Richard. This letter is mine. Your father wanted me to read it privately, and that's what I'm going to do." Catherine stood up. "Mom, this is ridiculous. We're a family. We should know what, Catherine. Your father made his wishes clear." "His wishes?" "His wishes were to give away $1 million and leave us scraps. He left you each over $100,000. That's not scraps. It's an insult," Richard shouted. His face was red. His hands were clenched. "That house is worth more than $2 million. We deserve our share." "That house is mine," Margaret said quietly. "Your father left it to me." "For now," Richard said, and there was something in his voice, a threat so thin and sharp it was almost invisible, like a wire stretched across a doorway. "For now, Mother." He walked out. Catherine followed, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor. James lingered for a moment. He looked at Margaret with an expression she couldn't read. Guilt, maybe, or fear, or the particular kind of sadness that comes from knowing you're about to do something terrible and being unable to stop yourself. "Mom," he said, I just, I need. I know what you need, James." He left. Margaret sat alone in Patricia's office for a long time. The afternoon light moved slowly across the floor. Finally, she opened the letter, but she didn't read it that day. She couldn't, because when she unfolded the paper, her hands were shaking so badly that the words blurred and swam. And because the first line, just the first line, hit her so hard that she had to close her eyes and press the letter against her chest and breathe. The first line read, "Maggie, if you're reading this, then the game has already begun, and I'm sorry I can't be there to protect you from the players." "What game? What players?" She folded the letter. She put it in her purse. She drove home in silence, the October trees blazing with color on either side of the road. The world absurdly beautiful for a woman whose life was coming apart at the seams. She would read the rest later, she told herself. When she was calm, when she was ready. But she didn't know yet that she would never be ready. That the letter contained not just words but a map, not just a message but a weapon, not just her husband's love but his last, desperate, brilliant act of war. The next 3 months were a siege. Richard struck first. He hired an attorney, not just any attorney, but Victor Hale, a man known in legal circles as the Collector because of his reputation for extracting assets from estates the way a surgeon extracts tumors. Fast, precise, and without sentiment. The first letter arrived 2 weeks after the funeral. It was addressed to Margaret, but written in language designed to intimidate. Words like fiduciary responsibility, and undue influence, and mental competency evaluation. The letter suggested, politely, legally, with a careful cruelty of bureaucratic language, that Margaret was not mentally fit to manage the estate. That David's decision to leave her the house was the result of her manipulation of a dying man, that the children deserved a fair reassessment of the will. Margaret read the letter at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in her hands. She read it twice. Then she put it down and stared out the window at the garden David had planted. The garden that was already starting to brown because she didn't have the heart to tend it without him. She felt something then, something she hadn't felt since the night David died. Not sadness, not grief. Something hotter, something with teeth, anger. But she was Margaret Holloway. She didn't shout. She didn't throw things. She called Patricia in and said in a voice as calm as a frozen lake, "They're coming for the house, aren't they?" "Yes," Patricia said. "Richard's attorney is very aggressive. He's going to push for a competency hearing. On what grounds? On whatever grounds he can manufacture. Margaret, I have to be honest with you. This could get ugly." "It's already ugly, Patricia. My children are trying to rob me. Legally speaking, they're contesting the will. Morally speaking, they're trying to rob me." There was a pause. Then Patricia said, "Have you read the rest of the letter?" Margaret looked at her purse where the cream-colored envelope sat like a sleeping animal. "Not yet. You should." "I know. Soon, Margaret. I know." But she didn't. "Oh, not yet," because she was afraid. Not of the words. She trusted David. She was afraid that once she read them, everything would change. And she wasn't ready for more change. She had absorbed so much change already that she felt like a sponge that had been wrung and wrung until there was nothing left to give. Catherine's assault was more subtle but equally devastating. She launched a campaign of emotional warfare, calling Margaret daily with a combination of tearful pleas and veiled threats. "Mom, I'm drowning. Gerald and I are barely making it. The kids need things. New school, braces, the roof is leaking. Dad would have wanted us to have more." "You know he would have? Your father made his wishes clear, Catherine. His wishes were written when he was pumped full of morphine. He wasn't thinking straight. Your father was the sharpest man I've ever known, even at the end. Then why did he give away our money? Why did he leave everything to you? What did you do to him, Mom? What did you say to him when nobody else was around?" That last question, that accusation disguised as a question, it cut Margaret deeper than Richard's legal threats ever could, because it implied something monstrous. It implied that Margaret, who had loved David more than breath, more than sunlight, more than her own children, had somehow coerced him, had whispered in his ear, had played him like a puppet. She hung up the phone and sat in the dark kitchen for 3 hours. James's betrayal came last and hurt the most. He showed up at the house on a Sunday morning in July, 3 months after the funeral. He looked terrible, thin, unshaved, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and substances Margaret didn't want to name. He stood on the porch and shuffled his feet like a child who had broken something precious and come to confess. "Mom, I need to talk to you." She let him in. Of course she let him in. He was her James, her baby. The boy who used to crawl into her lap during thunderstorms and press his face against her neck and say, "Don't let the sky fall, Mama." They sat at the kitchen table. She made him tea. He didn't drink it. "Mom, Richard wants to sell the house. He says if you won't cooperate, he'll take it to court. The competency thing. He says he has doctors who will testify. Doctors who have never met me. He says it doesn't matter. He says the burden of proof is, James, what do you want?" He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw it, the battle the war between the boy who had drawn maps of imaginary countries and the man who owed money to people who didn't send letters before they collected. "I need $100,000, Mom." "What?" "I owe people. Bad people. They've given me a deadline. If I don't pay," he stopped. His hand was shaking. He put it flat on the table to steady it. "Mom, they'll kill me. I'm not exaggerating. These aren't credit card companies. These are, how much do you owe? 100,000, maybe a little more. James, your father left you $137,000. Silence. It's gone, he whispered. Margaret felt the room tilt, not dramatically, not like a movie, just slightly, just enough to make everything feel wrong, like a picture hanging crooked on a wall. Gone where? You don't want to know. I do want to know. I need to know. Mom, please. Just, can you take out a loan against the house? Richard said you could get. She stood up so fast the chair fell backward. Richard told you to ask me this. James flinched. He said if you gave me the money, he'd drop the competency case. So this is blackmail. No, no, Mom. This is me trying to survive. This is me. This is your brother using your desperation to get what he wants. Don't you see that? He doesn't care if you live or die, James. He wants the house. James's face crumbled, and for a moment, just a moment, Margaret saw her little boy, the one with the maps, the one who believed his mother could hold up the sky. I know, he said. I know he's using me, but Mom, I'm scared. Margaret sat down. She reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers were cold, thin. She could feel every bone. I will help you, she said. But not like this. Not through a loan against this house. There has to be another way. There's no other way. There's always another way. Your father taught me that. James pulled his hand back. Something changed in his eyes. The boy disappeared. The desperate man returned. Dad's dead, Mom. His lessons don't pay debts. He left. He didn't slam the door. He closed it gently, which was somehow worse. A slam would have been honest. The gentle click of the latch was a lie, a pretense of civility covering something rotten. That night, Margaret finally read the letter. If you're still with me, take a second and hit subscribe. This story is about to take a turn that nobody, not Margaret, not her children, and certainly not you, sees coming. She sat in David's old armchair, the one that still smelled faintly of his cologne, sandalwood and cedar, the scent of safety, and she unfolded the cream-colored paper with trembling hands. Maggie, if you're reading this, then the game has already begun, and I'm sorry I can't be there to protect you from the players. I know our children. I know what they'll do when I'm gone. I've known for years. I've watched them circle this house like wolves around a fire, patient and hungry, waiting for the flame to die. I should have said something sooner. I should have confronted them, but I was a coward, Maggie. A father who couldn't bear to see his own reflection in his children's eyes and find nothing he recognized. So I made a plan, not a grand plan, not a perfect plan, but the best plan a dying man could make for the woman he loves more than anything he's ever built, earned, or owned. The locked room at the end of the hallway holds everything you need, everything, and you will have to win. The key is not a physical key. I know that sounds cryptic, and I'm sorry. You always hated when I was cryptic. But the key is in this letter. It's in the words, read carefully. Our wedding song was playing the night I first told you I loved you. Remember the restaurant? The candles. You were wearing blue. You said, David Holloway, if this is a line, it's the best one I've ever heard. And I said, it's not a line, Margaret Rose. It's a fact, Margaret Rose. Those two words, that's the key. The combination lock on the room is set to a number code. Each letter of Margaret Rose corresponds to its position in the alphabet, Margaretrose. Add them together. That number opens the door. Inside, you will find what I've spent 3 years building for you. My last gift, my best gift, not the biggest. I know you never cared about big, but the truest. I love you, Maggie. I have loved you since that restaurant, and I will love you past wherever I'm going. Don't let them take what's yours. Don't let them take what's ours. And don't let them convince you that you are less than what you are. You are everything. Yours in this life, and whatever comes next, David. Margaret sat in the chair for a long time after she finished reading. The house was silent around her. The grandfather clock ticked in the hallway. The wind pressed against the windows. And something inside her, something that had been curled up and sleeping since David died, something small and fierce and stubborn, woke up. She didn't go to the room that night. She wasn't ready. David had said she would know when she was ready, and she trusted him. She had always trusted him. She had always trusted him. But what she discovered next changed everything. 3 weeks after reading the letter, Margaret received a phone call that made her blood run cold. It was from a locksmith named Terry Boyle, a nervous man with a reedy voice who said, Mrs. Holloway. I'm calling because I was hired to open a lock at your property last week, and something about the job didn't sit right with me, and I wanted to make sure you authorized it. I didn't authorize anything. What lock? A combination lock on a door at the end of a hallway. A man named Richard Holloway hired me. He said he was the homeowner, and Margaret's grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles went white. Did you open it? No, ma'am, I couldn't. It's not a standard lock. It's a high security unit, custom built. I told Mr. Holloway I'd need specialized equipment in a few days. He said he'd call me back, but he never did. I just, I looked up the property records and the house is in your name, so I wanted to confirm. Thank you, Mr. Boyle. Thank you for calling. She hung up. Her hands were shaking, but not with fear this time, with fury. Richard had been in her house. While she was out grocery shopping, visiting David's grave, sitting in Patricia's office going over legal documents, her eldest son had entered her home with a locksmith and tried to break into the locked room. But she didn't know yet how deep the betrayal went. She called Patricia immediately. I need security cameras installed at my house today. What happened? Margaret told her. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised Margaret. He's desperate. Richard's business is failing. I did some digging after you told me about the competency threat. His development company is 3 months from bankruptcy. He owes creditors nearly $2 million. The house isn't about inheritance, Margaret. It's about survival. They're all desperate, Margaret said. Every single one of them, which makes them dangerous. I know. Read the letter again, Margaret. Whatever David left in that room, I think it's time. That was the moment everything started to feel wrong. Not just emotionally wrong, physically wrong. Things in the house began to change. Small things at first. A drawer left open that Margaret was certain she had closed. A window unlocked that she always kept latched. The faint smell of cigarettes in the upstairs hallway. James's brand. Newport lights. Someone was entering her home. The security cameras installed 2 days after the locksmith's call confirmed it. Not Richard this time. Catherine. Beautiful, polished catalog, perfect Catherine. Caught on camera at 2:14 a.m. on a Thursday, slipping through the back door with a flashlight and a copy of the house key, a copy she must have made years ago, back when she still had access. Margaret watched the footage on her laptop with Patricia sitting beside her. On screen, Catherine moved through the dark house like a woman who knew exactly where she was going. She went straight to the hallway, straight to the locked door. She tried the handle. It didn't budge. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening as if the room might whisper its secrets. Then she knelt down and examined the combination lock with her flashlight, turning the dial experimentally. Random numbers. She didn't know the combination. After 20 minutes, Catherine gave up. She walked back through the hallway, pausing at the kitchen. And this is what made Margaret's stomach drop. Catherine opened the refrigerator, took out a carton of milk, drank directly from it, and put it back. Such a small thing, such a mundane violation. But it spoke volumes. It said, "This is mine. All of this is mine. Even your milk, even your home. You are living in my future, old woman, and I am just waiting for you to get out of the way." That's breaking and entering, Patricia said calmly. We can file charges. She's my daughter. She broke into your home at 2 in the morning. She's my daughter, Patricia. Patricia looked at Margaret with something between admiration and exasperation. Margaret, your children are not acting like your children. They're acting like creditors. You need to stop treating this like a family dispute and start treating it like what it is. What is it? A war. Margaret closed the laptop. She looked out the window at the garden, David's garden. The tomatoes were long dead. The beds were choked with weeds. Everything he had planted was gone. Then I need to arm myself, Margaret said. That night, she went to the locked room. The hallway seemed longer than she remembered. The photographs on the walls watched her pass David and Margaret on their wedding day, young and impossibly bright. Richard is a baby, fat-cheeked and laughing. Catherine at her ballet recital, all toil and determination. James at 6, holding up a crayon drawing of a house with a huge yellow sun. All those moments, all that love. Where did it go? How does love rot? Is it sudden, like fruit left in the sun? Or is it slow, like a house settling, the cracks appearing so gradually that you don't notice until the walls start to lean? Margaret stood before the door. The combination lock was exactly as David had described, custom-built, heavy, gleaming like a polished eye. She pulled the letter from her pocket. She had calculated the number days ago, but hadn't been able to bring herself to come here. M13, A1, R18, G7, A1, R18, E5, T20, R18, O15, S19, S19, E5. She added them together, 140. The lock was a 4-digit combination. She entered 014 Nothing happened. Her heart sank. Had she miscalculated? Had David made a mistake? She tried again, hands trembling. 0140. Nothing. She leaned her forehead against the cold wood of the door and closed her eyes. Think, Maggie. Think. David was meticulous. He didn't make mistakes. If the number was 140 and the lock needed 4 digits, then she tried 1410. The lock clicked open. The sound was small, a mechanical whisper, but in the silent hallway, it was thunderous. Margaret removed the lock with shaking hands. She turned the handle. The door swung open. The room was dark. She reached inside and found the light switch. What she saw made her legs give way. She grabbed the doorframe to keep from falling. She stood there, gripping the wood. Against the far wall stood a heavy oak desk, and on that desk were 3 thick folders, red, blue, and green, each one labeled with a name. Richard, Catherine, James. Beside the folders was a stack of bound documents, each one marked with the seal of the state of Connecticut. Property records, corporate filings, financial statements, tax returns. On the desk's surface, arranged in neat rows, were USB drives, 12 of them, each labeled with a date and a description. R. Holloway, offshore account transfers. C. Dalton, fraudulent insurance claims. J. E. Holloway, wire transfers, gambling debts, forged checks. On the wall behind the desk were photographs, not family photographs, surveillance photographs. Richard meeting with a man Margaret didn't recognize outside a bank in the Cayman Islands. Catherine signing documents in a notary's office with a signature that wasn't hers. It was Margaret's. Forged. James accepting a brown envelope from a man in a parking garage. And in the center of the desk, weighted down by a small stone from the beach where David had proposed, was another letter. Maggie, now you're ready. I spent 3 years gathering everything in this room. I hired a private investigator named Frank Malone. His number is in the red folder. I worked with a forensic accountant named Diane Pratt. Her report is in the blue folder. And I consulted with a criminal attorney named Samuel Vuss. His strategy is in the green folder. Here is what our children have done. Richard has been embezzling from his own company for 6 years, funneling money into offshore accounts. He has committed tax fraud totaling approximately $1.3 million. If this information reaches the IRS and the CC, he faces federal charges and up to 15 years in prison. Catherine forged your signature on 3 separate financial documents, attempting to redirect funds from our joint accounts into her own name. She also filed 2 fraudulent insurance claims using your identity. She has committed identity theft and fraud. James, and this one hurt me the most, Maggie, because he was always the gentlest of them, has been stealing from us for years, not thousands, tens of thousands. Through forged checks, unauthorized wire transfers, and a power of attorney document he created using a notary he bribed. The total is approximately $87,000. Our children are not just greedy, Maggie. They are criminals. And they have been targeting us, targeting you, for longer than either of us knew. The folders contain everything. Evidence, documentation, witness statements, expert analysis. It is enough to put all 3 of them in prison. It is enough to destroy them, but I don't want you to destroy them. Not unless you have to. What I want is for you to be safe. What I want is for you to have leverage. What I want is for them to know, to truly know, that they cannot touch you. That the house is yours, that the life we built is yours. And that if they ever try to take it from you, the consequences will be theirs, not yours. Use this wisely, Maggie. You are the wisest person I know. One more thing. In the bottom drawer of the desk, you'll find a bank book. It's for an account I opened in your name 3 years ago. I've been putting money into it every month. Money from a life insurance policy our children don't know about. The balance as of today is $642,000. That's your freedom, Maggie. No one can touch it. No one knows about it. It's yours. Me, I told you the room held everything you needed. Fight well, my love. Dave. Margaret sat at the desk and wept. Not from sadness was there, permanent as a scar. She wept from something she couldn't name. Relief, gratitude, awe, the sheer staggering love of a man who, while dying, had spent his final years not preparing for death but preparing for her survival. She opened the folders. She read every page. She looked at every photograph. She listened to audio recordings on the USB drives, phone calls, conversations, admissions of guilt captured by a private investigator who was very, very good at his job. It was all there. Every theft, every forgery, every betrayal. And suddenly the locked room made sense. David had kept it locked not to hide treasure or money or secrets in the traditional sense. He had kept it locked because it contained the truth. And the truth in the hands of the right person was more valuable than any inheritance. But Margaret didn't call her children that night. She didn't call Patricia. She didn't call the police. She sat in the room until dawn, surrounded by the evidence of her children's corruption, and she thought about what she wanted. Not revenge. She was not a vengeful woman. Justice. She was a just one. Now, the blood. We return to that October night, the smear on the kitchen floor, the trail leading to the hallway, the footstep upstairs. Margaret stood in her kitchen, phone in hand, heart pounding. She knew now who had been in her house. She knew about Catherine's midnight visits. She knew about Richard's locksmith. She knew about James's key because she had found a copy of her house key in the surveillance footage slipped under the back doormat by someone who thought they were being clever. But the blood was new. The blood was wrong. She put the phone down. She walked into the hallway. The trail was dark against the hardwood floor, a breadcrumb path of violence leading toward the now unlocked room, because Margaret had not replaced the combination lock after her visit. She had left the door closed but unlocked, planning to return the next morning to organize the evidence. Someone had discovered this. The door was open. The light inside was on. And sitting at David's desk, surrounded by open folders and scattered photographs, was James. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. His face was a wreck, pale, tear-streaked, terrified. His right hand was wrapped in a blood-soaked kitchen towel. He had cut himself breaking the window latch on the back door. The blood trail was his. "Mom," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. Margaret looked at her youngest son, at the folders open in front of him, at the photographs of his siblings' crimes spread across the desk, at the USB drive plugged into a laptop he had brought from home. "You were copying the files," she said. Not a question. James swallowed. "Richard sent me. He found out you opened the room. He has someone watching the house. He saw you go in last night. He called me this morning and said I had to get in and see what Dad left. He said if I did this, he'd pay off my debts. And you believed him." "I had to believe him, Mom. I don't have a choice. You always have a choice, James." He looked at the files. At his own folder, the green one, open to a page detailing his forged checks, his unauthorized transfers, the $87,000 he had stolen from his own parents. "Did you know?" he asked. "Did you know Dad knew?" "I found out the same night you did. He knew everything." "Everything we did, everything we—" James's voice broke. He put his head in his hands. The bloody towel fell to the floor. Margaret walked into the room. She sat down across from her son, and she did something that surprised them both. She took his injured hand and began to clean the wound. "This is deep," she said. "You need stitches." "Mom, aren't you? Aren't you angry?" "I am furious, James. I am more furious than you can possibly imagine. But you are bleeding, and I am your mother, and those two facts exist at the same time," he sobbed. Ugly, broken, honest sobs. The kind he hadn't cried since he was a boy afraid of thunder. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry, Mom, for all of it. The money, the lies, coming here tonight, all of it." "I know you are. What are you going to do?" Margaret finished wrapping his hand with a clean cloth from the desk drawer. She looked at the folders, at the evidence, at the weapon David had built for her. "I'm going to end this," she said. "Drop a comment right now. Are you Team Margaret? Because what she does next is going to blow your mind." The meeting took place on a Saturday morning in November in the living room of the Holloway house. Margaret had called each of her children and told them, simply, "Come to the house at 10 o'clock. All of you. It's time Richard arrived first in his expensive suit with Victor Hale at his side. Catherine arrived second with Gerald looking polished and hostile. James arrived last alone with his hands still bandaged and his eyes still red. They sat in the living room, the room where they had opened Christmas presents as children, where David had read them bedtime stories, where Margaret had served hot chocolate during snowstorms and bandaged scraped knees and told them over and over that they were loved. Margaret stood by the fireplace. Patricia Wynne stood beside her, along with a man no one recognized, tall, gray-haired, with the quiet authority of someone who had seen every possible version of human behavior and was no longer surprised by any of it. His name was Samuel Voss, the criminal attorney from David's green folder. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said. "Let's make this quick," Richard said. "My attorney is prepared. Your attorney should sit down and listen," Samuel Voss said pleasantly, "unless he'd prefer to learn what we have to discuss in a courtroom." Victor Hale frowned but said nothing. He sat down. Margaret opened a folder, the red one. "Richard," she said, "over the past 6 years, you have transferred approximately $1.3 million from your company's operating accounts to 3 offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. You have falsified tax returns, submitted fraudulent financial statements to investors, and committed securities fraud. I have bank records, wire transfer confirmations, and recorded conversations in which you discuss these transactions with your accountant." The color drained from Richard's face. "Not slowly, all at once, like a plug had been pulled. That's where did you?" Margaret opened the blue folder. "Catherine, you forged my signature on 3 financial documents, attempting to redirect funds from accounts that belong to me. You filed 2 fraudulent insurance claims using my social security number and personal information. You committed identity theft and fraud, which carry sentences of up to 14 years in the state of Connecticut." Catherine's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Gerald put his hand on her arm. She shook it off. Margaret opened the green folder. "James, you stole $87,000 from your father and me through forged checks, unauthorized wire transfers, and a fraudulent power of attorney. You bribed a notary to certify documents you had no legal right to create." James didn't react. He stared at the floor. He had known this was coming since the night in the locked room. He had been the only one who knew, and he had said nothing to his siblings, the first honest act of his adult life. The room was silent. The grandfather clock ticked. The November light was thin and gray. Richard spoke first because Richard always spoke first. "You're bluffing." Samuel Voss smiled. It was not a warm smile. "Mr. Holloway, I have spent 4 months reviewing the evidence your father compiled. I have verified every document, authenticated every recording, and consulted with federal prosecutors, hypothetically, of course, about the likely outcomes of each case. Your mother is not bluffing. She is offering you something far more valuable than a bluff." "And what's that?" Richard's voice was steady, but his hands were not. "Mercy," Margaret said. The word hung in the air like a held breath. "Here are my terms," Margaret said, "and they are not negotiable." She spoke for 10 minutes. In that 10 minutes, she dismantled every threat, every scheme, every legal maneuver her children had constructed. She was calm. She was precise. She was devastating. The house would remain in her name, permanently. The competency challenge would be withdrawn immediately. Any copies of her house key would be surrendered. Richard, Catherine, and James would sign legal documents acknowledging that the will was valid and binding. There would be no further contact with Victor Hale or any other attorney regarding the estate. If any of these conditions were violated, the evidence would be delivered to the appropriate federal and state authorities within 24 hours. Additionally, Margaret said, each of you will write a letter, not to me. I don't want your apologies because I'm not sure you're capable of genuine ones yet. You will write a letter to your father, explaining what you did and why. You will deliver those letters to his grave. You will leave them there. And you will mean what you write, or so help me God, I will know the difference. Catherine was crying, quietly, carefully, the way she did everything, with attention to appearance. Mom, how can you? We're your children. Yes, you are my children, which is why I'm not sending you to prison, which is why I am giving you the chance to walk out of this room as free people. Do you understand what I am giving you? Do you understand what David could have done? What anyone else would have done with the evidence in these folders? No one spoke. Your father spent the last 3 years of his life, the years when he should have been enjoying his garden and reading his books and holding my hand, building a case against his own children, because he knew you would come for me the moment he was gone. He knew you would try to take everything. And he loved me enough to make sure you couldn't. She paused. Her voice, which had been steady as iron throughout, cracked just slightly on the next words. He also loved you enough to leave the choice to me. He could have set this in motion automatically. He could have arranged for the evidence to go to the authorities upon his death. But he didn't. He put it in my hands because he hoped that I might find a way to save you from yourselves. She looked at each of them in turn. Richard, who had finally stopped talking. Catherine, whose tears had ruined her careful makeup, revealing the real face beneath. James, who was looking at his mother with something that might, in time, become respect. I am choosing mercy today, but mercy is not weakness, and it is not permanent. If you test me again, if you come near this house with lawyers or locksmiths or copies of my signature, I will not choose mercy a second time. The silence stretched. Then Samuel Voss placed 3 sets of legal documents on the coffee table. Sign these, and this matter is concluded, he said. Richard signed first. His hand shook, but he signed. Catherine signed second, leaving a tear stain on the paper that blurred her middle name. James signed last, and when he looked up at Margaret, he said something so quietly that only she heard it. Thank you, Mama. It was the first time he had called her Mama in 30 years. They left, one by one. The door closed behind them, and the house was quiet again. Patricia squeezed Margaret's shoulder. Samuel Voss shook her hand and said, "Your husband was a remarkable man, Mrs. Holloway." "I know," Margaret said. Margaret said. When they were all gone, Margaret walked through the house alone. She locked the front door. She locked the back door. She checked every window. She walked down the hallway past the photographs, past the wedding, the baby, the ballet recital, the crayon drawing, and she stood in the doorway of the locked room. David's room. Her room now. She sat at the desk. She opened the bottom drawer and looked at the bank book. $642,000. Her freedom. Her safety. Her future. She picked up the letter, the first one, the cream-colored one with the wax seal, and she held it against her chest. She could smell the sandalwood. She could hear faintly, like an echo from another world, the song that had been playing in that restaurant 41 years ago when a young man with kind eyes and a nervous smile had said, "It's not a line, Margaret Rose, it's a fact." She closed her eyes. The house settled around her. The grandfather clock ticked. The November wind quieted. And Margaret Holloway, widow, mother, survivor, sat in the room her husband had built for her and allowed herself, for the first time in 7 months, to feel safe. 6 months later, the garden was in bloom again. Margaret had replanted it herself. Not David's garden, not exactly, but something new. She kept the tomatoes because she couldn't imagine the yard without them. But she added lavender and sunflowers and a row of rosemary bushes along the back fence that filled the air with a sharp, clean scent that made her think of beginnings. Richard had filed for bankruptcy. His company was gone. His third wife left him. He was living in a small apartment in New Haven, working as a consultant for a firm that paid him a fraction of what he used to earn. He had not contacted Margaret since the meeting. But she had heard, through Patricia, that he had visited David's grave and left an envelope there. She didn't know what was inside. She didn't need to. Catherine had entered therapy. Gerald had found out about the forged signatures and the insurance fraud, and their marriage had nearly collapsed. But they were still together, barely tentatively, like 2 people learning to walk again after a long illness. Catherine had called Margaret once in February. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Catherine said, "I'm working on myself, Mom." Margaret said, "Good." That was enough for now. James had checked into rehab for the 4th time, but this time was different. Margaret could hear it in his voice when he called from the facility. A clarity that hadn't been there before. A quietness. He was drawing again. Maps of imaginary countries. He sent one to Margaret in the mail with a note that said, "For your wall, if you want it." She hung it next to the crayon drawing from when he was 6. Margaret sold nothing. She donated nothing. She moved nothing. The house remained exactly as it was, a monument to a marriage, a testament to a love that had outlasted death and greed and betrayal and every small, terrible thing that humans do to each other when they are afraid. On the anniversary of David's death, Margaret walked to the garden. She knelt beside the tomato plants, green and strong, reaching for the sun, and she pressed her hands into the earth. It was warm, alive. It held the memory of every season that had come before and the promise of every season yet to come. I fought well, David, she whispered, and the wind moved through the lavender. The sunflowers nodded their heavy golden heads. Somewhere in the house, the grandfather clock chimed. And Margaret Rose Holloway stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and walked back inside. Not because she had to, because it was her home. It had always been her home. And now, finally, she was no longer afraid to live in it. The strongest people aren't the ones who never get knocked down. They're the ones who get up, dust off the dirt, and say, "Not today. Not ever again." If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories that stay with you long after the last word. And remember, love doesn't end at death. Sometimes that's exactly where it begins.